and welcome back to the How to Podcast series. I have a new podcasting friend here on my screen as we record today. An amazing podcast. Long COVID MD is the website. It's the podcast. It's everything. And Dr. Zeest Khan is on with me today. Her friends call her Zeest, which I do as well. And I'm so glad she's here. And not only has she got an amazing podcast to address something that a lot of people debate about, a lot of people have opinions on, and some people have no idea what it's about at all. But she comes on not only as an expert in the field of medical experience, but also someone battling through long COVID. And Dr. Zeest is here to talk about her show, her journey as a podcaster. And if you're looking for a podcast that's very gentle and very helpful and very encouraging for anyone battling long COVID or knows someone battling long COVID, this is the ideal podcast for you. You have to listen to this, and you have to listen to every episode. Dr. Zeest is on the podcast. Zeest, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Dave, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me on. I've been listening to your podcast for quite a while, and it means a lot to be on the co-host with you.
So it is so weird to see you on the screen when I listen to your show, and then you're here. It's kind of like I'm kind of fanboying a little bit because I love what you do and I love who you help. And, you know, it's so nice to have the connection with you in person as well as you do this virtually, but I love your show. Tell everybody about your podcast. And when did this all start for you? When was your first episode? Give us a little background on the show.
Thanks. It's so generous of you to pay me these compliments. And as I'm listening to you do your intro, I'm so impressed because long COVID, as I've mentioned to you a few times since we've met, has really impacted my cognition and made it especially challenging to be a podcast host where you need to speak and speak clearly. But I'm Zeest Kahn. I live in the California Central Valley, which is not the LA beaches and it's not San Francisco. It's part of the bulk of the rest of the state where a lot of our food for the country is grown and raised. I have a podcast that I started almost a year ago, like you said, called Long COVID MD. And I started it because I had been diagnosed with long COVID and actually had to leave my medical career because of it. And it had already been a few years since my diagnosis, and I felt ready to share my story and ultimately connect with other patients who were experiencing the same things I was. You talk a lot about community building on your podcast, and that was really important to me as well. So Long COVID MD started as a challenge to myself to be courageous enough to share what I perceived as a new weakness, which is hard for a doctor to do and for a lot of people, and to also collaborate with other people. The third thing was that I wanted to, rattle my brain a little bit and fire some neurons by learning a new technology and a new process. So I started in October of 2023. I focus on how people with long COVID can utilize the existing healthcare system to get some symptom relief and improve their functions after a diagnosis with long COVID. So long COVID is a condition that occurs sometime after an acute COVID infection. It is poorly understood, but is part of a family of conditions called infection-associated chronic conditions, IACCs, where you suddenly feel terrible for a really long time after an acute illness. Some people think about getting mono in college, and then they're sick for months and months. That's probably an infection-associated chronic condition. And long COVID probably affects the immune system. It probably affects the vascular system. and it leaves people with tremendous fatigue and issues with a lot of organ systems. So I've heard someone say, if you've met one person with long COVID, then you've met one person with long COVID, because everybody's combination of symptoms can be different. Because I have worked in healthcare for so long, so I'm an anesthesiologist by training, and I subspecialize in adult cardiothoracic anesthesia, which means I specialize in open heart surgery and lung surgery. I was doing the toughest of the toughest jobs, taking care of the absolute, I can confidently say, the absolutely sickest patients in the hospital who were on the brink of death. That was my job. It required, really fine-tuned skills that I had learned over decades, and required really a lot of focus during each procedure. So I thought this podcast was a nice way to combine my experiences and share what I know so far with other people.
Wow. Okay. So how long have you been away from serving as a doctor on staff and doing everything that you trained to do? How long have you been away from this?
My last day of work was March 11th, 2021. And I remember that date because I've had to write it down on so much paperwork since then. So yeah, it's been several years since I have practiced clinical medicine.
How does the medical community react to one of their own going off like this, and in all the things you're going through? Like, you have peers who you've gone through school together, you've done residency together, you've done all these things we see on all of those TV shows about doctors and hospitals. My wife loves those, by the way. You have all these comrades and people that you've worked with, people that you know, and they know you so well. How is the medical community responding to people who have long COVID?
Well, those medical shows are unrealistic in a lot of ways, but they are pretty spot on in reflecting the bonds that you make with your co-trainees. It is in a lot of ways similar to being in battle with a group. You bond over funny things, you trauma bond as well. And it is a really tough experience to complete medical training. And one of the skills that you develop is a really thick skin and this very strong need or intuitive need to always demonstrate strength and resilience and confidence. There is a saying in medicine that was not originally tongue-in-cheek, and it's not always said tongue-in-cheek. Asking for help is a sign of weakness. And it's absolutely not true, but that's the, here's my word finding difficulties. That's the sort of perspective that you learn to approach not only medical work, but, your whole life. And so that's a lot of pressure. So when you ask, how did my peers respond to this? It took me a lot of courage to admit that I was ill. I will tell you, when I had to call my, my boss, for a lack of better word, when I realized I couldn't work anymore, I had to break a work contract because I physically couldn't do it anymore. The overwhelming emotion I felt was shame and embarrassment. Like, how am I going to spin this? How am I going to do this? How can I admit this? And that's actually one of the reasons I started Long COVID MD, is because I wanted to get over that embarrassment, because I knew in my mind that this was not my fault and this is not something to be ashamed of. I also know absolutely with every fiber in my being that I don't approach patients like this. I don't think less of my patients. I never have, because they have had to need my experience. They've had to need my service. So why was I putting such pressure on myself, and why was I putting such judgment on myself? I will say once I got over that, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, especially from my my friends who I trained with. They have been very supportive, and I actually learned the phrase long COVID from one of my residency classmates. She reached out to me in 2021 because her hospital needed extra staff. So she wanted to see if I was available to work. And when I told her my symptoms, she called me and she said, "You need to talk to my sister. She was discharged a few months ago from the hospital after a COVID infection. She was perfectly healthy before, and now she has long COVID, and all of the symptoms you're explaining to me that don't make sense to you are very similar to what she experienced." So from every step of the way, there are themes of me sort of getting over my pride, and also learning how to receive the outpouring of help and support that other people have offered.
When I think of a doctor coming into the room to meet with a family or a patient, I always kind of feel like when a doctor comes in, I sit up straighter. Like, oh my gosh, like here comes wisdom, knowledge, the expertise that you have as a doctor, I don't have. There's no way. I know, right? And the respect for people to be so focused on a specific thing, and you're the expert in the room as you walk in, to then be the person who is battling long COVID and looking for words, looking for motivation, trying to stay healthy, trying to stay up and going. Like, what a dichotomy between the two. And how do you balance that? Like, you have so much knowledge in you from all of your training and expertise and everything you've ever done, to now having to kind of relearn some of these things and re-find yourself. How do you navigate that?
It's so interesting that you talk about like who has the expertise, because that has been a real big question in the long COVID community. Like, who is the expert here when there are no experts? What you're speaking to about sitting up straight when the white coat enters the room, it reflects the power dynamic between a patient and a physician. And that power dynamic does not always serve the patient. The patient's not the one in control. The patient is the vulnerable one. And I think physicians underestimate how much power they wield over somebody else, because I see that now. I knew it was there. Like, I knew I need to knock on the door. I need to introduce myself. When I walk into the clinic office, that's not my room. That's the patient's space. And yet still, I was so floored by how nervous I felt when my doctor walked into the room and I was the one no longer in the white coat. I was the one in the hospital gown. So, I think this experience it's an opportunity for me personally to reassess, like, what is the role of a physician? What is the need that a physician fulfills for a patient? How can this relationship be improved, even structurally? And then I had another thought, but it's gone.
There you go, everybody. That's how that works.
I think about these things and these like word finding difficulties that a lot of people with long COVID have. I imagine a kid holding a helium balloon, and then, you tie a little helium balloon to a kid's wrist, and then it gets loose and like floats away, and they immediately stop. If they were walking, they stop and they look up, and their mouth is open. Like, how did that happen? I don't understand how that happened. And that's what it feels like when I lose my train of thought. Like, I can lose my train of thought in the middle of a sentence.
Right. Now, we kind of talked about this before we hit record. When it comes to editing your podcast, we could take those moments out. Like, I could go in there and put on my doctor's outfit and surgically remove those little pauses and those little things to make it sound really good. But does that really honor the audience who has long COVID and is experiencing that? Because we talked about this in relation to somebody with a traumatic brain injury that I had on my show. And they actually made reference to the fact that they lose thoughts and they have to reorder their thoughts before they can answer a question, which causes pauses that they feel like they're ashamed of in the moment. So in that situation, I could have gone in and fixed all the pauses and tightened everything up, and you'd never know until the person actually says in the interview that that's who they are. And I'm feeling like if I do that, if I edit all of that out, I'm really not giving a true representation to my guest, and I'm not giving a true representation to the person listening who is identifying with the guest. So I leave them in, and people are like, well, you should make it better, tighter, shorter, clean it up. Sometimes I think that we do better to leave that stuff in, because then as a listener, I can identify with you going, okay, I'm not alone in this world. Somebody I admire, a doctor who's doing this podcast, not to become rich and famous, but to serve an audience, is struggling like I am. I feel so attached to you in that moment that it's kind of like, it's just kind of a seal of approval that I can get better. I can work through this. And you're my leader. You're my guide from a medical perspective, but also just a human to human connection. I love that. So that whole editing side, I'm kind of selfishly asking, but how do you feel about that? Like, should we leave that in to honor our audience? What do you think?
I think it's such a great question and such an important topic. And it's been something that I have had to debate with myself. So when I think about a podcast episode, I am always thinking about the listener. And I keep in mind what you have mentioned on the How to Podcast series of talk to your listener, single person, one person, individual, because there is one person listening to you at any given moment. When I'm editing and when I'm planning a podcast episode, I ask myself, what does that person need? What is it that I'm trying to offer? What is the lesson that I have learned that has helped me that I now want to pass forward? So editing the podcast, it depends, I guess, is the answer. For some episodes, like interviews, especially when I'm interviewing another person with long COVID, we can go a little bit off the rails. And I think it doesn't serve the listener to hear all of that thought process and the tangents. I'm actually serving my listener by editing it very intentionally. The thing about long COVID that has, taught me this universal lesson that's kind of cliche is that we only have so much time. We only have so much energy. How do I want to spend this time? So when somebody's listening to me who has long COVID, I don't want to waste their time and I don't want to stress them out. I want to benefit them. So I want to tell a story effectively. So if that story requires editing, then I edit. That being, I edit pretty aggressively. And that takes a lot of effort and makes me pretty exhausted. So I'm still learning how to toggle between tasks. I'm still learning how to be patient with myself. I'm still learning how to be comfortable with imperfections. I'm still learning what a deadline means and reminding myself that those are arbitrary, like who is running your life. The answer is I am running my life. So let me do what serves me also. But I think it is really important to have balance. So I'm used to, as a physician, serving my patient. As an anesthesiologist, I meet someone for a few minutes for the first time, oftentimes, right before they're having open heart surgery or part of their lung is being taken out.
Right.
And I'm in charge of putting them to sleep and waking them up. Like, that's a huge responsibility. And so in service of that patient, what that patient needs to see is my signs of my competence and very quickly signs of my compassion. They don't need to see all the dirty details. It actually doesn't help them. It's going to make them more nervous, and so it'll also make the family more worried. But in this space with the podcast, I've had to remember that the what's on the line is different. Like, the acuity is different here. I'm not it is not a life and death situation anymore. And there is actually a benefit in authenticity and vulnerability, where that wasn't my role. That wasn't helpful in my role as a physician. I met with a group of patients with long COVID a few years ago for a university study. And I remember sitting across from somebody who was trying to answer a question and was really struggling. And I almost, I smiled internally because I was like, that's what I sound like. I know that's what I sound like. He's fumbling over the same parts of a sentence that I fumble over. So to answer your question, like, it's a balance. Like, I'm always asking what is going to help the person listening. If it's an informative episode, I want to be super clear. It helps to be really simple. It helps to be straightforward. It helps to be slow, like paced and precise. When I'm doing a storytelling or like sharing a personal anecdote and being vulnerable, especially when I talk about how my illness has affected my family and my worries about how my illness has affected my family and my young kids, then it's really important. I'm benefiting and serving my listener by being as accurately vulnerable, I guess, like being the real me on the fly.
Okay. And that goes back to the tone of your show. That goes back to how you present yourself. When I listen to your show, you have such a crystal clear voice. Like, it just cuts through everything. It's very welcoming. It's like you feel like you're in the right place. You're not talking quickly. I'm like 3 words behind you at all points, and I'm trying to keep in touch with you and keep up with you. Kind of like when I watch the doctors walk the hallways at the hospital, everybody's just like running behind them as they go to the next room, right? That's what I don't want to feel like when I listen to your show. I don't want to be like chasing you down the hallway, trying to keep up. You are there and you slow down and you explain things and you talk to me as a listener. And I think that's something people can learn to do on their show. Maybe they need to slow down a little bit. In a world where everything is going so fast all the time, I love that your show is kind of the opposite of that. You do slow down and you do talk to me. So that's something I really enjoy.
That's so wild that you say that. And thank you, because one of the first symptoms I had was that I literally lost my voice. So I couldn't podcast until I could podcast because I couldn't speak. I'm like a lot of people, don't really like listening to my voice. I've gotten used to it now. Like it's less cringy, but the pace is out of necessity. Like I can't think, I have to speak this slowly because I can't speak fast and I can't speak as animated. And sometimes I wonder, I'm like, oh, like I listen to other people on the podcast and they're so slick and they say so many ideas and make their points so quickly and smoothly. And I know that they've probably like practiced and rehearsed that, but that's not me. One of my girlfriends the other day said that your podcast reminds me of, remember the SNL skit with that Alec Baldwin was on?
Yes.
The NPR.
Yes.
The NPR ladies. So I take it, I think it's legitimate. I think it's applicable.
There you go.
So I think, whenever you have your voice, you use your voice. And as you've said, like your voice really matters and it resonates with other people.
Yeah.
And I'm slow right now and my listeners are slow.
There you go. And again, the only person who can do your show is you. I couldn't do the Long COVID MD podcast. There's no way I could do that show. So the only one who can do your show is you. And that's what I love about what you bring to your podcast. All the medical knowledge you have, you have great connections with other people in the space who can talk to this. You can help people. You have a good bedside manner, right? As a doctor comes in and sits down on the side of your bed or stands at the foot of your bed and gives you the details, you have all of that just in your training alone, and you're translating that into a podcast setting. Superb. Like that's something that a lot of people could not do. So again, your show is your show and no one else could do it. And if you don't do it, no one's going to do this show.
Yeah.
Really. So that's what I love about what you do.
Thank you. You said a lot there and it really means a lot. I wonder how you do 8 shows. Like, how did I think a lot about I spent a lot of time especially when I couldn't speak, I spent a lot of time thinking about what should my podcast be? What do I want my podcast to be? You have multiple shows. Like, how did you decide, here's a specific topic, here's a perspective that I think is worth exploring on a podcast?
I'm just a very curious person. And when I see a gap in the space where no one else is talking about something the way that I would talk about it, I'm like, well, I guess I have to do it. Like no one else is doing this. And so for this podcast specifically, there's a lot of podcasts about podcasting, but what I don't hear is a lot of podcasts about podcasting that brings in multiple voices to talk about podcasting from different perspectives other than just me, Dave, my voice, my opinions. Because at the end of the day, I don't know what I don't know. And until I figure out what I don't know, I don't know about it. So when I come on and be the voice of podcasting, I kind of feel that's a little bit of a stretch. I'd much rather have you on and all of the other amazing guest co-hosts come on because I get to learn. We together get to help somebody, and somebody's going to identify with you and how you do your show over how I do my show. So I want them to feel welcome and then connect them with you and for them to come listen to your show, share your show, follow you, support you. That means more to me than someone following me. I'm here trying to build a community around podcasting. Again, instead of being a single voice. When I have my Dad Space podcast, it's because I'm a dad and I am an empty nest dad and I miss my kids. And there's no one here except me and my wife and my cat. So I want to talk to dads and go, dads, when your kids are 3 years old and you're like frustrated and you wish they would hurry up and grow up already, hang on. There's going to be a day where you're going to be sitting in my chair going, what happened? Where'd everybody go? So I want a podcast that talks to dads to say, listen, you can do this. And here's the support. Here's great people in your corner that help you be a better dad. But realize you only have 18 summers with these kids and then it's over. They're gone. So slow down, enjoy the moment, and listen to a dad who's down the road from you say, you can do better than I did as a dad by listening to this show. And then I have an author podcast and I have a music podcast. I'm just following all of the things that interest me. And if I had more days, I'd have more shows, but my wife cut me off at 8. So I just follow my curiosity. And I think that makes for great podcasts, not because of me, but because of my curiosity. That's kind of what I chase. So that's kind of my approach to everything I do.
I've listened to a couple of your podcasts because I just recently realized you have so many. And I mean, it's still you with every topic. And True. I like, your approach, which is what I think maybe kind of a crass way of saying it. It's like the opposite of bro culture. Like, I'm not going to listen to a bro tell me how to crush anything.
Thank you. Yes, no.
Like, I want to listen to someone who's like, hey, keep this in perspective. This is the big picture. And here's how to take the next step. How did you, though, because it's hard to put yourself out there.
Oh, yeah.
I've already mentioned the word vulnerability a few times. Like, how did you have a problem or, feeling awkward getting started or how, and if you did, like, how did you get over that? Or are you just one of those very confident people who knows that?
I'm quite insecure.
You're crushing it.
I'm pretty introverted. I don't, again, when I first started, I didn't like the sound of my own voice. I didn't like putting myself out there because I'm going to get judged and people are going to be like, who's this guy? You don't know anything, but I just wanted to value people. I'm on this mission to collect people. I think that's my mission in life. I'm here to collect people. So where other people collect money and fame and trinkets and boats and cars and houses and all that, I'd much rather collect people and know that my words can help somebody or that I can introduce somebody to someone who can help somebody. That brings me a lot of joy. So everything I do, I try to reframe it. Again, being an introverted person, I don't like the attention on me. So I like to refocus it on my guest. That's why I do co-hosted episodes. I want people to connect with you. I want to be the facilitator to help it happen, but I feel like a success if somebody goes from this show to your show and follows you and supports you. That's how I know I did a good job today. That's my goal in life, is to collect great friendships. That's why I do podcasting.
That's the ultimate jujitsu move of an introvert. And I love what you say about collecting people. It brought a tear to my eye. It's what a precious asset. Like, we have lots of assets, but like, there's nothing more precious than the people around you.
It's a very different success metric than what's being promoted out there in the space right now. Where you have to get to 1,000 listens, you got to get to 100,000 downloads, you got to get to this, you got to get to that. All these metrics that people promote as success, I fight against it. I would much rather have one person listen to my show, and people kind of fight me on this sometimes, but one person who listens to my show and goes, I can do this. I can be a podcaster, or I can be an author, or I can be a dad, I can be a musician. Whatever show they're listening to from my catalog, if one person is impacted and can do the next thing because of something that came from this show, then that's a success for me. And I'm not going to make $1 million from this if only one person takes the step. But I love, there's a quote I talk about often on the show, the apple seed quote, where you can count the number of seeds in an apple, but you can't count the number of apples in a seed. So one person listens to the show, it changes their life, they treat their partner better, their kids better, whatever, and their life is different for the future because of something that came from me. Like, you can't measure that impact. And that's not going to show up in any stat analytic on your podcast. But to know that somebody had an impact and your words meant something to somebody, like, how do you measure that? So for me, that is really my true measure of success. Did I connect with one person today? Did I do that? And if I haven't, then I need to review what my motive is, because that's really why I do this.
I have two thoughts that come to mind. Who knows if I'll remember the second one by the time I finish the first one. But I was editing a podcast, episode that I recently did, where I ended up talking to several people about the same topic. And last night, after I was like reviewing it, I was thinking, wow, I know all these people now. I know people who I would never have met, and they are so cool. And I've learned something from them, and now they're in my network. And so the podcast did that in a way that nothing else could have. And then the second thing is that a lot of people with chronic illnesses, especially since COVID infections are still a really active threat, because of our energy limitations and because we're really picky about how we choose to be outside, we interact a lot online. And if you scan any social media site with people with long COVID or chronic conditions, they don't talk about, like, if I got better tomorrow. Nobody says, if I got better tomorrow, I'd go to work, I'd go make $1 million. Everybody says something about either doing something that fulfills them emotionally, whether that's like sitting in a park, or even like going for a run, doing something that makes them feel good. And you're going to notice that one of the things that is so painful about having a condition that isolates you is that your relationships suffer. Like, the people who you're with, that collection is affected. And so, I don't know, it really makes you think, like, if you're spending your time doing a project, it's really helpful to keep in mind your intention. What are you getting out of this? What is the value in this for me and for somebody else?
So, Zeest, for somebody who's thinking about starting a show, they're listening to your words, they're listening to our conversation, and they're thinking, well, you're a doctor, so you're going to know more than me. I'm not a doctor. So who would ever listen to my version of a long COVID show or my version of my podcast that I'm thinking about doing? Who cares what I have to say? What would you say to somebody who's battling that initial hump they have to get over to even start a show in the beginning at all?
So many things are coming to mind, but I think the most pressing one is to remember that there are billions of people in the world, and somebody else is going through what you are experiencing, and somebody else is going to be comforted or entertained by you sharing your experience, and also developing your talent. Like, if you are worried about what other people are gonna say or respond, then do it for selfish reasons, right? If you were suddenly physically limited and debilitated or became completely disabled, it really shakes you to be like, what do I want to do with my limited energy and time? Do what is fun. Do what's interesting to you. Do it for selfish reasons. You can do it for service reasons, but don't be intimidated by it. Something in medicine we learned, I do I did or do know so many complex procedures, and I work with my hands every day. We're bound to make mistakes or fumble or embarrass ourselves in the operating room or in the hospital. And I remember more than one of my attendings or teachers telling me, there is no mistake that you will make that somebody else has not made.
Mm-hmm.
So the spotlight is not as big as you think it is. And it's more of like a theater spotlight to make you shine than it is an interrogation spotlight to make you sweat.
It's a good perspective to bring into everything in life, right? Podcasting or outside of podcasting. I like that perspective. So for people that are interested in following your journey through your podcast and knowing more about your show, again, take us to your website and to all of that information so we can come follow and be a part of your community. Talk a little bit about that.
Please do. So the podcast is Long COVID MD, and it's on all the typical streamers. I have 2 websites right now that hopefully I'll be able to join into one. longcovidmd.com is my podcast website. And I recently started a Substack that is taking off, I think, because there's a real need. longcovidmd.substack.com. Come join me over there and listen to the podcast and learn a little bit of something. I don't think there's a person out there who doesn't know somebody who is affected by long COVID.
There you go. And in true podcast fashion, Zeest, can you close us off today? Give us some more closing thoughts for a podcaster. Maybe they've been podcasting for a while, like you have. Just the motivation part to keep coming back. Like, talk to us about that as we close off.
I want to hear from you. I want to hear your podcast. And I know that there's a lot of other people who do too. This is a phenomenal community that you, Dave, have created. Keep going and have fun. Like, I know how serious life can be. This is not serious. This should be fun. And if it's not bringing you joy, step away from it, come back another time. But remember, it's a gift to be able to do something like this. And so I hope you keep enjoying it.
Every time you come into my life, Zeest, or my meetups or on screen, I'm still going to sit up straight when you're here, just so you know, because it's just something I'm wired. I have to do that. So, but I'm so glad you have your show. I'm glad to have you in my life and that I can shine a light on your podcast and all the great things you're doing. You may have taken off the coat for now, but you put on headphones and a microphone and you have a new platform, which now you have no limits to what country you're listened to. You have no limits to what time people listen and when they listen. You can reach the entire world with your voice, and you can help even more people than you've ever helped inside of the confines of a hospital or an operating room. You now have this new platform in front of you. So I'm excited to see where this takes you.
Thank you. You know, we call our stethoscope our ears. And so our headphones are our ears too. And we're in other people's ears. There's connections. Thank you so much, Dave. I think the world of you.
Excellent. Everyone, all information for Dr. Zeest in the podcast show notes, as always. And I'm asking you to go listen to every single episode from the beginning to the end of every episode. Rate, review, follow, share, do all that stuff. But also then tell somebody else about this show. I know you have somebody in your life who has been impacted directly or indirectly because of COVID. And you might know somebody who's struggling right now with long COVID. This is the best podcast around long COVID you're ever going to find because of not just the content, but the person. So please go and follow this show and share it with somebody today. Zeest, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dave.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast all the way through to the end. I love having these great guest co-hosts on the show to share their podcast with you. You have some homework to do. And what I'm asking of you is to go check out our featured guest co-host today. Go over and listen to their podcast. The links are always in the show notes. And I'd love for you to go and give them your love and support. And I think if we can all do that for each other, podcasting will be a lot more fun for all of us. So it's time to do what you've asked others to do for you. It's time to do for this guest co-host. Links in the show notes. Go over and check out their show and leave them a review, do the follow, go listen to their episodes in full, the entirety of an episode, which again shows to the apps that it's a good podcast because you're going there and you're staying to the end. Probably one of the best ways you can help a podcaster grow their audience and be shown to more people is by simply going and listening wherever you listen to the very end, like you're doing right now here. This is the perfect way to signal to wherever you're listening on, this is a podcast worth promoting. And all of the apps want you to stay on as long as possible. So go over and listen to our guest co-host episode and leave them some feedback. If they have a buy me a coffee, send them a coffee. If they have a speak pipe, send them a voice message. If they have an email, send them an email. If they're on Instagram, send them a direct message. Do something to support our guest co-hosts. They've given up their time to be here with you, to be here with me, and we can give that back to them with time and attention, our love, our support. Thank you for doing all that for me as well. Here on the How to Podcast series, we'll talk to you soon for our next episode.